The meadow was our sanctuary, mine, my mom's, and Jasper's. But when the meadow gave Jasper back to me, I didn't realize it had its own rules, its own cost. Now, I'm faced with an impossible choice. Keep the one thing I have left, or restore the balance my mother once protected. The meadow is alive, and it's calling me to decide. How do you say goodbye to the love that holds you together? Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. If I had known how little time I had left with Mia, I would have held her longer. I would have whispered every lesson, every bit of love, so she'd never doubt it when she needed me most. But life doesn't give us time for perfect goodbyes. Instead, I'm here, watching her from somewhere beyond, helpless as she clings to the few things we once shared. The meadow was ours, mine, and now hers. It's where Jasper carried her laughter and dreams. It's where I taught her to ride, to trust the world beneath her feet. After I was gone, it became her refuge. And Jasper, that gentle, loyal horse, became her anchor to something she thought was forever. That day began like many others, the sun dipping low, bathing the golden meadow in soft light. From where I watch, I saw her, small yet strong, perched atop Jasper as they moved together. Her voice carried on the breeze, a mix of murmured encouragements and playful commands. I hadn't heard her laugh like that in what felt like years. "Come on, boy," she urged, leaning forward to pat Jasper's neck. "Let's race the sun." Jasper trotted with an ease that belied his age. He was older now, his pace slower, but his heart was still strong for her. Together, they moved like the meadow itself, alive and full of memory. Then it happened. It was subtle at first, a misstep, a slight stumble. Then Jasper faltered, his legs buckling beneath him. The world seemed to tilt as Mia cried out, her voice slicing through the quiet. Jasper crumpled to the earth, and Mia tumbled from his back, landing in a tangle of limbs and grass. "No, no, no," she said, scrambling to her knees. "Jasper." She was at his side in seconds, her hands shaking as they pressed against his neck. His breathing was labored, his body still. "Come on, boy. Get up. Please, get up." Her voice cracked, desperation spilling over as she buried her face in his dark coat. "Don't leave me too. Please, not you too." I felt her pain as if it were my own, the raw, unfiltered ache of a child who has lost too much. Watching her, powerless to hold her or comfort her, was agony. I had trusted Jasper to be her strength, and now he lay there unmoving. Then the meadow stirred. The air shifted, thick with a quiet energy. It was subtle at first, like the hum of an unspoken thought, but then it grew. A soft, golden light began to seep from the ground, stretching across Jasper's body. Mia gasped, pulling back as the light enveloped him. Her tear-streaked face turned to awe, confusion flickering in her wide eyes. The light swirled around Jasper, warm and radiant, until his chest rose with a deep, steady breath. "Jasper?" she whispered, barely daring to hope. He stirred beneath her hands, his head lifting slowly as he let out a soft whinny. Mia froze, her breath hitching as she placed her hands on his neck, feeling the pulse of life beneath her palms. "You're okay," she said, her voice trembling. "You're okay." Relief flooded her as laughter and tears mingled. She wrapped her arms around his neck, holding him as if he might disappear. "You're okay, Jasper," she repeated, her words a prayer and a promise. From where I watched, I felt her joy and her love. But as Jasper stood, stronger than before, I couldn't ignore the unease curling in the pit of my chest. The meadow had given something back to her, something precious. But gifts like that never come without a cost. The meadow felt different now. The wind didn't carry its usual playful whispers, and the golden grass seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting. Something had shifted the moment Jasper rose from the ground. I could feel it, even from here. And I knew Mia could too. Jasper was alive, and for that, Mia was grateful. How could she not be? But the spark of joy that had bloomed in her chest was tinged with uncertainty. As she led him back to the barn that evening, she kept glancing over her shoulder at the meadow. It was no longer the haven she once knew. "Let's get you home, boy," she whispered, her voice steadying as she stroked his neck. Jasper nickered softly in response, but his gait was different, stronger, more fluid, as if the years had melted away in an instant. Mia didn't notice at first, still caught in the relief of his survival. But I saw it. He moved like a creature untethered, as though the meadow had gifted him something unnatural. The next morning, Mia woke early, her sleep restless. Jasper's fall haunted her dreams, but so did the golden light. It lingered in her mind, flickering in her memory like a flame that refused to extinguish. She dressed quickly and hurried outside, the barn coming into view as the sun crept over the horizon. Jasper was already awake, stamping his hooves against the ground with a restlessness she didn't recognize. "Hey, easy," she said, opening the stall. "What's got into you?" Jasper nuzzled her shoulder, his breath warm against her skin. For a moment, Mia felt the same comfort she always did in his presence, but then she noticed it. The energy beneath his movements, the way his ears flicked towards sounds she couldn't hear. "Let's go for a ride," she decided, hoping it would calm him. The meadow stretched before them as they set out, its golden hues rippling under the morning light. But the silence was different now, not the peaceful kind she loved, but a heavy quiet that made her stomach twist. As they rode, Jasper's behavior grew stranger. He tugged at the reins, pulling her toward a part of the meadow they rarely visited. "Jasper, stop," Mia said, trying to steady him. But he was insistent, his pace quickening as they reached a small clearing. It was here that Mia first saw them, the burned circles in the grass. She slid off Jasper's back, her feet sinking into the soft earth as she approached. The circles were dark and precise, their edges too perfect to be natural. She crouched beside one, her fingers hovering just above the charred soil. "What is this?" she murmured, her brow furrowed. Jasper stood a few paces behind her, his head low as if in deference to something unseen. Mia glanced back at him, her unease growing. Then she saw it, a faint glow emanating from the center of one of the circles. Her heart skipped as she leaned closer, her hand reaching instinctively toward the light. Buried just beneath the surface was a small stone, smooth and round, pulsating with a soft, golden hue. "What in the world?" She hesitated, but curiosity and an inexplicable pull drove her to pick it up. The moment her fingers closed around the stone, a tingling sensation shot up her arm. It wasn't painful, but it was strange, like holding something alive. The stone fit perfectly in her palm, its warmth spreading through her like a whisper of the meadow's energy. For a moment she felt connected. To Jasper. To the grass beneath her feet. To the air itself. But then the feeling faded, replaced by a quiet unease. Mia slipped the stone into her pocket and turned back to Jasper. "Come on, boy. Let's head back." Jasper followed obediently, but he stopped frequently, his ears flicking toward the horizon as if listening to something only he could hear. That evening, Mia sat at the dinner table, her food untouched as her father, Ethan, watched her from across the room. "You've been quiet," he said, his tone gentle but curious. "Everything okay?" Mia hesitated. She wanted to tell him about the stone, about the circles, about the way Jasper seemed different. But she could already see the skepticism in his eyes. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice flat. "Just tired." Ethan didn't press further, but I could see the worry etched into his face. He wanted to help her, but he couldn't see what she saw. As the night deepened, Mia lay in bed, turning the stone over in her hands. It glowed faintly, its light a soft reminder of the meadow's strange energy. She whispered into the dark, her voice barely audible. "What are you?" The stone gave no answer, but the tingling returned, faint and fleeting. And as Mia drifted into uneasy sleep, I knew the meadow's secrets were far from done with her. I remember the first time I saw it, the figures standing in the circles. I was younger than Mia, maybe her age, and the meadow had whispered to me, just as it does to her now. It wasn't a voice, exactly. It was something deeper, something you felt in your bones. I had hoped she wouldn't have to face it, but the meadow chooses who it calls. Mia tossed in her bed that night, the stone resting on her nightstand. Its faint glow pulsed steadily, matching the rhythm of her heartbeat. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the burned circles in the grass, felt the tingling in her fingers, and heard the unspoken pull of the meadow calling her back. Finally, she gave in. Quietly, she slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her father. The stone felt warm in her pocket as she pulled on her jacket and boots. Stepping into the cool night air, she made her way to the barn, where Jasper stood alert, as if waiting for her. "Couldn't sleep either, huh?" she whispered, running her hand along his neck. Jasper nickered softly, his restless movements mirroring her own unease. She saddled him quickly, the two of them setting off under the pale glow of the moon. The meadow was eerily silent, its golden grasses swaying gently in the night breeze. Mia's heart raced as Jasper guided her to the same clearing from earlier that day. The burned circles were there, stark and unnatural against the earth. She dismounted, her boots crunching softly against the dry grass as she approached. The stone in her pocket began to glow brighter, its light casting faint shadows around her. "What is this place?" she murmured, more to herself than to Jasper. Then, she felt it, a shift in the air, like the meadow itself was holding its breath. The wind stilled, and the grasses seemed to freeze in place. From the center of the largest circle, a figure began to materialize. Mia's breath caught as she stepped back instinctively, her hand flying to her pocket. The figure was translucent, almost ethereal, with a form that flickered like the flame of a candle. It was tall, human-like, but its presence was far from earthly. The figure raised its head, and though it had no discernible face, Mia felt its gaze pierce straight through her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "You are the key," the figure said, though its voice wasn't a sound. It resonated inside her, deep and steady, like a bell tolling in her chest. "The key to what?" Mia managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. "To balance." Mia stared, her mind racing. "I don't understand. What does that mean? Why did he come back?" "The meadow gave what was taken," the figure replied. "But nothing returns without a purpose. The energy has been disturbed. It must be restored." The words hit Mia like a blow. "Are you saying Jasper shouldn't be here?" The figure tilted its head, the light surrounding it growing brighter. "To hold on to what was taken is to upset what must be. You must decide." "Decide what?" Mia cried, her voice cracking. "He's alive. He's here. Why can't I keep him?" The figure's glow dimmed slightly, as if in sympathy. "The meadow gives life, but it is not infinite. The choice is yours. Hold on to what was taken, or restore what was lost." Mia's chest tightened as the weight of the words settled over her. She looked back at Jasper, who stood quietly behind her, his eyes calm and trusting. "I can't lose him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It simply raised a hand, pointing toward the stone in her pocket. Its presence faded, the burned circles falling back into shadow as the meadow's stillness returned. Mia stood frozen, her hand clutching the glowing stone as her mind raced. The figure's words echoed in her head. "The choice is yours." She turned to Jasper, her throat tight with emotion. "What do I do, boy?" Jasper nickered softly, his warm breath brushing against her cheek as he stepped closer. He seemed calm now, at peace, as if he understood something she didn't. Mia swallowed hard, her heart pounding as she climbed back onto his back. Together, they rode through the quiet meadow, the stone's glow fading with each step. When they reached the barn, Mia dismounted slowly, her legs shaky. She looked into Jasper's eyes, her fingers brushing the soft fur of his muzzle. "Tomorrow," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'll figure this out tomorrow." But even as she said the words, I could feel the storm brewing inside her. Tomorrow might come with answers, but it would also come with impossible choices. I'd hoped she'd never have to find it. The journal was my way of leaving something behind for Mia, a thread connecting her to the parts of me I couldn't explain when I was alive. It held the truth about the meadow, about the stone, about the choices I'd made, and the ones I knew she'd someday face. The house was quiet the next morning, but Mia couldn't sleep. The stone rested on her desk, cold and lifeless now, yet its image lingered in her mind. She sat cross-legged on her bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she stared out the window. Jasper grazed in the field, calm and serene, as if nothing had happened. But Mia knew better. Something had happened, something big. And now it was up to her to figure it out. She slipped out of bed, her feet padding softly across the creaky floor. The attic door groaned as she pulled it open, and a wave of musty air hit her nose. Climbing the narrow staircase, she flicked on the light, illuminating the cluttered space filled with boxes and forgotten relics of her family's past. Mom always said there were answers up here, she murmured to herself, brushing dust off the nearest box. She searched for what felt like hours, her fingers trailing over old photo albums, trinkets, and books until she found it, a faded leather journal tucked inside a small wooden chest. Her breath caught as she pulled it out, her hands trembling slightly. The journal was unmistakable. The leather was cracked, worn from use, and the faint scent of lavender lingered on its pages. Her mother's handwriting covered the first page, familiar and steady, like a voice she hadn't heard in years.
Mia.
If you're reading this, it means the meadow has called you, as it once called me. I hope you never needed this, but if you did, I hope these words help you find your way. Mia sat down on the attic floor, her heart pounding as she flipped through the pages. The entries were filled with stories of the meadow, of golden sunsets, of quiet moments with Jasper when he was just a foal. But as she read further, the tone shifted. Her mother described the day she first discovered the burned circles, how she had found the glowing stone buried in the soil. It was alive in my hand, pulsing like a heartbeat. I didn't understand it then, but I could feel the meadow's energy, its connection to everything around me. Mia's fingers hovered over the words, her chest tightening as she read the next entry. The figure appeared to me that night, just as it must have appeared to you. It told me what it tells everyone who finds the stone. Nothing returns without a purpose. I didn't know what it meant then, but I think I do now. The meadow is alive, and its energy isn't infinite. It gives, but it also takes. Mia's breath hitched. The figure, the stone, the meadow, it was all connected. Her mother had been through this before, faced the same impossible choice. The final entries in the journal were the hardest to read. I chose to let the meadow be. The stone was a gift, but I couldn't keep it without taking more than I could give. I left it buried in the circle, hoping the balance would hold. Now, I wonder if it's calling out to you, because my choice wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Mia wiped at her eyes, her vision blurring as tears threatened to spill. Her mother had faced the figure, held the stone, and walked away. But Mia wasn't sure she could do the same, not when Jasper was alive, standing in the field like a piece of her mother's love made real. That evening, Mia sat on the porch with a journal in her lap, the stone warm in her pocket. She watched Jasper as the sun dipped below the horizon, his coat glowing faintly in the golden light. Her father, Ethan, joined her, holding a cup of coffee. He didn't speak at first, just sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You've been quiet," he said finally, his voice soft. Mia hesitated. She wanted to tell him everything, the circles, the stone, the figure, but she wasn't sure he'd believe her. "Dad," she began, her voice shaky, "do you think there are things we can't explain? Things that might not make sense but still feel real?" He glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "Your mom believed that. She used to say the world was full of mysteries we weren't meant to understand." Mia looked down at the journal, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover. She wrote about the meadow, about something she found there. Ethan's expression softened. Your mom loved that meadow. She always said it had a kind of magic to it. It does, Mia whispered. She hesitated before adding, but magic always comes with a price, doesn't it? Ethan didn't reply, but the look in his eyes told her he understood more than she thought. As the stars appeared in the sky, Mia clutched the journal tightly to her chest. She had the answers she'd been searching for, but they only brought more questions. The meadow had called her mother once. Now it was calling her. I could feel the weight of her decision bearing down on her, the way it had once pressed on me. It's an ache you can't explain, a love so deep it hurts to let go. I made my choice long ago, but now it was Mia's turn. And there are no easy answers when the meadow calls for balance. The air in the meadow was heavy, almost alive, as Mia rode Jasper through its familiar paths. The golden grasses swayed around them, but their beauty felt muted, as if the meadow itself knew what was about to happen. The stone pulsed faintly in Mia's pocket, its glow weaker than before. Each pulse reminded her of what the figure had said. To hold on to what was taken is to upset what must be. Mia tightened her grip on Jasper's reins. This isn't fair, she whispered, her voice trembling. Jasper's ears flicked at her words, his steady gait comforting in its rhythm. He didn't understand what she was saying. How could he? But it felt like he knew, in some unspoken way, that their time together was running out. They reached the clearing just as the sun began to set, its light casting long shadows over the burned circles. Mia dismounted slowly, her boots crunching against the dry grass. Jasper stood still, his gaze fixed on her as she pulled the stone from her pocket. It felt warm in her hand, almost comforting, but its steady pulse reminded her of the impossible choice before her. The figure appeared again, emerging from the largest circle. Its translucent form flickered in the fading light, and its presence was both overwhelming and strangely calming. You came, the figure said, its voice resonating within her. Mia swallowed hard, her throat tight. You said I had to choose. But why me? Why Jasper? He didn't do anything wrong. The figure tilted its head, the light around it softening. The meadow gives life, but it is not infinite. What was taken cannot remain without cost. Mia's hands trembled as she clutched the stone. He's my best friend, she said, her voice cracking. He's all I have left. The figure's glow dimmed slightly, as if in sympathy. Love does not end in letting go. It becomes something greater, something eternal. Mia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I can't do it. I can't lose him. The figure stepped closer, its light casting a gentle glow over Jasper. He was brought back to help you heal. Now you must help him rest. The meadow's balance depends on it. Mia turned to Jasper, her chest tightening as she looked into his warm, trusting eyes. He nuzzled her shoulder, his breath soft against her cheek. It was as if he was telling her it was okay, that he trusted her to do what was right. I don't want to lose you, she whispered, wrapping her arms around his neck. I don't know how to say goodbye. Jasper stood still, his calm presence grounding her as she wept into his mane. The sun dipped below the horizon, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink as Mia stepped toward the circle. Her hand shook as she placed the stone in the center, its glow brightening for a moment before fading completely. The meadow stirred, its grasses swaying as a golden light spread across the clearing. Jasper stepped into the circle, his movements slow and deliberate, as if drawn by the light. No, Mia whispered, her voice breaking. She reached out for him, but stopped herself. Deep down, she knew this was the right thing to do. Jasper turned to look at her one last time, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling. For everything. The golden light engulfed him, bright and warm, until his form was no longer visible. The meadow fell silent, the light fading into the night. Mia stood frozen, her hands hanging limply at her sides as tears streamed down her face. She felt hollow, like a piece of her had been taken away. But then, the wind stirred, carrying with it the soft rustle of the grasses and the faintest hint of Jasper's presence. It was as if he was still there, watching over her, a part of the meadow now. Mia knelt in a circle, her fingers brushing the cool soil where the stone had been. She stayed there for what felt like hours, her heart heavy but her mind clear. "Goodbye, Jasper," she whispered, her voice soft. "I'll never forget you." As the first stars appeared in the sky, Mia rose to her feet, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The meadow was quiet again, its balance restored, and though her heart ached, she felt a strange sense of peace. Jasper was gone, but he hadn't left her. He was part of the meadow now, part of her. And as she walked back to the barn, she realized that love doesn't end. It just changes shape. When the meadow fell quiet that night, I felt the ache of her loss echo through the stillness. Mia had made her choice, the hardest choice, and now the emptiness was settling in. But I also felt something else, something small but powerful, her strength. It was fragile, like a sprout breaking through the earth, but it was there. Mia walked back to the barn alone, her footsteps heavy against the dirt path. The golden glow of the meadow had vanished, leaving behind the same quiet it had always held. But to Mia, it felt different now, emptier. She opened the barn door and stepped inside, the scent of hay and leather filling her senses. Jasper's stall was just as she had left it, his bridle hanging neatly on the hook. For a moment, she stood there, staring at the empty space where he should have been. Her hand reached out, brushing against the wooden rail, and her chest tightened. The barn felt too quiet, too still without him. "I did the right thing," she whispered aloud, her voice trembling. It was a statement, but also a question, one she wasn't sure she could answer yet. The next morning, the sun rose as it always did, casting a warm glow over the meadow. Mia sat on the porch steps, her knees drawn to her chest, the journal resting in her lap. Her father, Ethan, stepped outside, holding 2 mugs of steaming tea. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing her a mug before settling beside her. Mia wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, grateful for the comfort it brought. They sat in silence for a while, the soft hum of the morning filling the space between them. Ethan finally broke the silence. "The barn feels quiet today." Mia nodded, her throat tight.
"Yeah."
He glanced at her, his brow furrowed in concern. "You want to talk about it?" She hesitated, unsure of how to explain everything she had seen and felt. But then she opened the journal, flipping to the page where her mother's handwriting described the meadow's energy, the balance it demanded. "Mom wrote about the meadow," she began, her voice shaky. "About how it gives and takes. She faced the same choice I did." Ethan's expression softened, a mixture of understanding and sadness. "Your mom always said the meadow was special. I didn't know how much it meant to her until she was gone." Mia traced the faded words with her fingers, her mind drifting back to the figure's voice and the golden light that had taken Jasper. "I had to let him go," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "It was the only way to fix what the meadow gave me." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "I don't know if I could have made that choice," he admitted. "But I'm proud of you, Mia. Your mom would be too." The days that followed were quiet but heavy. Mia spent most of her time in the meadow, sitting in the clearing where the burned circles had been. The stone was gone, and the soil had begun to heal, but she could still feel the energy of the place, subtle, steady, alive. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Mia closed her eyes and let the soft breeze wash over her. The meadow felt peaceful again, as if it had returned to what it was always meant to be. And in that peace, she felt Jasper. Not in the way she used to. No soft whinnies or gentle nudges, but in the rustle of the grasses, the warmth of the sun, and the stillness that filled the air. He was there, part of the meadow now, a piece of her life that would never truly leave. Mia picked up the journal and wrote her first entry. "Mom, I made the choice just like you did. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I think it was the right one. The meadow is quiet again, and Jasper feels close, even if I can't see him. I miss him, and I miss you. But I think I understand now. Love doesn't end. It just changes. Jasper is part of the meadow, and you're part of me. And that's enough. As she closed the journal, she felt a sense of closure settling over her. The ache in her chest was still there, but it was softer now, less sharp. She stood and walked back toward the house, her steps lighter than they had been in days. The meadow stretched out behind her, golden and serene, a reminder of everything she had lost and everything she had gained. Mia didn't know what the future held, but she knew this. The meadow would always be there, just as Jasper would always be with her. The meadow looked the same as it always had, golden and alive under the late afternoon sun. But to Mia, it was different now. Every blade of grass, every ripple of the wind, carried something more, something she couldn't quite explain but felt deep in her heart. Jasper was gone, but he wasn't far. And I was here too, watching her take the first steps toward something new. Weeks had passed since the night Mia let Jasper go. The ache in her chest was still there, but it was quieter now, a soft reminder of what she'd lost and what she'd gained. She walked the meadow often, feeling its energy shift and settle, as if it were finally at peace. On this particular day, Mia carried the journal under one arm, her steps light as she made her way to the clearing. The burned circles had faded, replaced by fresh shoots of grass, vibrant and green. She knelt in the center, running her fingers over the soil where she had placed the stone. "I'm back," she said softly, her voice carried by the breeze. The meadow responded in its own way, the grasses swaying gently as if to greet her. Mia smiled, her heart swelling with both sadness and gratitude. Opening the journal, she flipped through the pages her mother had written, her handwriting steady and familiar. Each word was a bridge, connecting Mia to the woman who had loved this meadow before her. But today, she didn't stop at her mother's entries. Taking the pen from her pocket, Mia turned to a blank page and began to write. To whoever finds this, the meadow is alive. It gives and it takes. And if you're here, it's because it's called you, the way it once called me and my mother. It's not easy to understand, and the choices it asks you to make aren't fair. But if you listen carefully, you'll feel it, the balance, the love, the connection to something bigger than yourself. Mia paused, staring at the words before continuing. I let Jasper go. He was my best friend, my safe place, and losing him broke my heart. But I think I know now that love isn't about holding on. It's about letting go when the time comes and carrying what you've shared with you. She set the pen down, the weight in her chest lifting slightly. The journal was more than a record now. It was a part of her, and a part of her mother's legacy. As the sun began to set, Mia rose to her feet and looked out over the meadow. Its golden hues glowed in the fading light, and for a moment, she felt them both, Jasper and her mother, together, watching over her. You were right, Mom, she whispered. The meadow is special, and I'll take care of it. I promise. Her words felt like a vow, a promise not just to them but to herself. She had lost so much, but she had also found something deeper, a strength she didn't know she had, and a love that would never fade. That evening, Mia sat on the porch steps, the journal resting beside her as she watched the stars blink into the sky. Her father joined her, his presence quiet and steady. You seem lighter, he said after a while, breaking the comfortable silence. Mia nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. I think I'm starting to understand, she said. About Mom, about Jasper, about the meadow. It's all connected, isn't it? Ethan nodded, his gaze distant. Your mom used to say the same thing. She said the meadow had a way of teaching you what you needed to learn. It does, Mia said softly. And I think I'm ready to listen now. As the weeks turned into months, Mia's visits to the meadow became less about loss and more about connection. She began to notice the little things she had once overlooked, the way the grasses whispered in the wind, the way the sun dipped below the horizon in a blaze of gold, the way the meadow seemed to hum with life. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was a part of her, and she was a part of it. One day, as she sat in the clearing, She looked out over the rolling hills and whispered, "Thank you." It was a thank you to the meadow, to Jasper, to her mother, and to herself. For the love, for the lessons, and for the strength to let go and move forward. And as the wind rustled through the grasses, she felt an answer, not in words, but in the quiet understanding that she was exactly where she was meant to be.